The sun was not a source of life in the desert of Zin. It was a relentless, searing eye that watched the Israelites stumble through the furnace of the wilderness. Here, the landscape was a jagged tapestry of stone and shifting dust, a place where the wind carried the dry sting of salt and ancient desolation. For 40 years, this horizon had remained a cruel, unchanging circle. The heat was an oppressive character itself, a weight that pressed against the lungs and turned every breath into a struggle against the atmosphere of the desert. The miracles of the past, such as the seas parting and the bread from heaven, felt like ghost stories told to children who had never known the shade of a roof or the scent of rain-drenched earth. Among the thousands trudging through the grit was Caleb, a young father whose back ached from the weight of his meager belongings and the crushing uncertainty of their future. He looked down sadly at his youngest son, whose small feet moved rhythmically through the burning sand, and felt a bitter pang of resentment. Caleb had been born into the beautiful promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, yet all he had ever known was the taste of dust and the constant gnawing, empty hollow in his stomach. Every step toward the horizon felt like a step further into a void. He remembered his father speaking of great wonders in Egypt, but looking at the parched lips of his child, those wonders felt like cruel illusions. His faith, once a sturdy staff, was now a fragile and splintering reed, bowing under the weight of the silence from the scorching heavens. Around him, the air was heavy with more than just heat. A different kind of fire was rising, a slow burning anger that manifested in hushed voices and sharp glances. The poison of discontentment was spreading through the camp like an unseen infection, passed from tent to tent in the dead of night. They spoke of the miserable food and the death trap Moses had led them into. It was a spiritual rot, a collective amnesia that wiped away the gratitude for their freedom and replaced it with a toxic and desperate longing for the chains of their past. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This growing rebellion was a storm cloud gathering in the dark sky without the promise of rain, a tension that vibrated through the parched ground they walked upon every single day. High above the encampment, Moses stood alone, a figure etched against the sky above him. He could hear the rising tide of bitterness, the jagged edges of their accusations cutting deeper than any physical hardship. To lead was to be the loneliest man in the whole wide world, and Moses felt the full gravity of that isolation as he watched the people turn their hearts back toward the distant land of their weeping. They saw only the stones and the scorpions. They felt only the burning thirst. They had forgotten that the God who brought them out was the same faithful God who sustained them. Moses looked out over the sprawling sea of his tents, sensing the frightening thinness of the divine hedge that protected them, a protection they were now actively tearing down with every sharp, biting word and bitter, rebellious thought. Then, without warning, the rhythm of the camp changed. The drone of complaints and the clatter of movement suddenly faltered. An unnatural, heavy silence fell over the desert of Zin, as if the wind had caught its breath in anticipation of a catastrophe. The birds that scavenged in the high crags went quiet. Caleb stopped in his tracks, his hand tightening around his son's shoulder as a cold shiver defied the desert heat. In the periphery of his vision, something moved. Not a person or a gust of wind, but a low, fluid shadow gliding across the golden sand with terrifying speed. More shadows emerged from the jagged cracks in the earth, weaving through the rocks like living ribbons of shifting flame. The first stroke of judgment had arrived, silent and lethal, waiting in the parched dust for the moment the divine hedge would finally break. The silence that had descended upon the camp did not bring peace. It brought a suffocating weight of anticipation. The Israelites, led by the fire of their own frustration, had reached a breaking point where the memory of their deliverance was eclipsed by immediate discomfort. Caleb stood in a growing crowd, his hand gripping his son's tunic. Around him, the desperate voices swelled, but this time, the hushed murmurs sharpened into public defiance. The people were no longer whispering. They were shouting their accusations into the air, directing their venom at Moses and the God who had led them into this void of Zin. "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die?" the voices cried, echoing off the harsh, jagged cliffs. Caleb felt the vibration of the crowd's anger in his chest. He looked at the parched earth, and for a moment, his own bitter heart joined the rebellion. The promise of a land of milk and honey felt like a fading dream, a cruel mirage designed to keep them walking until their bones were bleached. The collective amnesia was complete. Miracles were relics of a past that no longer served them. This was the moment where exhaustion finally turned into mutiny. The focus of their hatred was the provision that kept them alive. "Our soul loathes this light bread," so they declared, pointing to the manna. To Caleb, the manna was a symbol of a life of total dependence on a God he felt had abandoned them. By despising the bread from heaven, they were rejecting the life-giving nature of God himself every day. They were trading the miraculous for the safety of their former chains. This ingratitude was a corrosive acid. And as they spoke, the invisible divine hedge of protection that shielded them began to dissolve like morning mist. Caleb watched as the oppressive atmosphere changed. The wind ceased, leaving the air stagnant. A strange, unnatural heat rose from the earth, vibrating through his feet. Then, beneath the shouting, a new sound emerged, a low, threatening, rhythmic hissing that emanated from the cracks in the rocks. It was a sound that triggered an ancient fear in Caleb's gut. He pulled his son closer, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The hissing grew, 1,000 sandpaper whispers sliding across the stone, creating a wall of sound that eventually drowned out the voices of the protesters. It was the sound of a barrier being broken. The revelation of their vulnerability was sudden. As the rebellion reached its peak, God withdrew his hand, allowing the hidden dangers of the ancient and unyielding wilderness to surge into the vacuum. The fiery serpents emerged from the silent shadows. Their scales shimmered like molten copper, and their eyes held the cold focus of a judgment that would not be denied. These were not mere animals. They were the physical manifestation of the poison in the people's hearts. Caleb froze as he saw the first of them glide over the boundary, a fluid ribbon of fire moving fast across the sand. The camp descended into a terrifying and chaotic landscape. Rebels scrambled in panic. The spiritual protection was gone, and the wilderness was claiming its territory. Caleb felt nausea as he realized his resentment played a part in this tragedy. He had helped tear down the walls that kept the nightmares at bay. The hissing was everywhere, a chorus of approaching doom vibrating through the tents. Men who had complained about the food were now begging for their lives, but the air remained indifferent to their cries. The judgment was no longer a threat. It was a devastating reality. The horror became personal when Caleb heard a shattering and desperate scream from the tent directly beside his own. It was his neighbor, his companion in complaint. The scream was followed by the sound of furniture overturning and a desperate, choking plea for mercy. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked down at his helpless child's terrified face and then back at the shifting sand at the entrance of his own tent. The judgment had reached his doorstep. The first strike had landed, and the realization hit Caleb with a chilling and absolute force. The plague had begun, and there was nowhere to run. The air in the tent grew thick with the scent of ozone and scorched earth. Caleb's eyes darted toward the entrance flap as the first of the creatures slithered into the light of the dying embers. They were horrific, their scales not the dull brown of desert vipers, but a shimmering red that glowed from within. They were the color of forged bronze, moving with a supernatural grace that defied the friction of the sand. As they glided, the ground beneath them seemed to singe, leaving trails of blackened dust. These were the Seraph, the burning ones, and their presence turned the cool desert night into a furnace of judgment. Across the camp, the screams multiplied, a discordant symphony of agony that tore through the darkness. The strike of a fiery serpent was not like a normal bite. It was an electric flash of torment. Those bitten did not simply bleed. They burned from the inside out. The venom acted like liquid fire, racing through the veins and turning the blood into a searing river of heat. Caleb watched through the gaps in his tent as men he had worked alongside for years collapsed, clutching their limbs as their skin flushed a violent bruised purple. This physical agony was a visceral reflection of the spiritual fever that had gripped the camp, a burning rejection of God manifested in the burning of their own flesh. There was no medicine in their stores to combat this, no herb that could quench a fire ignited by divine decree. The camp had become a frantic, aimless swarm of terror. Caleb threw himself against the crates, dragging them toward the entrance in a futile attempt to seal the gaps. His breath came in ragged gasps. He could see his wife huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around their youngest son, whose eyes were wide with fear. Caleb's hands shook as he piled rugs against the tent walls, but he felt the futility of his actions. These serpents were not deterred by cloth or wood. They moved through the smallest fissures, slipping through the fabric of their lives. He realized then that no human wall could withstand a judgment born from the heart. His mind raced back to his bitter complaints about the manna. The poison was already inside them long before the snakes arrived. Outside, the chaos reached a peak. He heard the thud of bodies falling against the exterior of his tent, the muffled groans of those whose lungs were failing under the weight of the venom. He saw the shadow of a serpent glide across the roof of the tent, its glowing form visible through the woven goat hair. Moses stood in the distance, a silhouette of grief. The prophet did not flee. He walked among the dying, his face etched with profound sorrow. Moses was witnessing the disintegration of the people he had spent his life trying to save. Every scream that echoed through the rocks was a testament to the frailty of their existence, without the divine hand that had once walked before them in a pillar of cloud. The leader's eyes met the gaze of many who had cursed him. But there was no triumph, only the crushing weight of intercession. Then the nightmare breached Caleb's sanctuary. A single serpent, its scales a terrifying shade of molten gold, slipped through a hidden gap. It moved toward the corner where his family cowered. Caleb lunged, reaching for a staff, but he was too slow. With a strike faster than a heartbeat, the creature's fangs sank into his son's ankle. The boy let out a sharp cry that shattered Caleb's world. The serpent vanished into the shadows with a hiss, leaving behind two small glowing punctures in the child's skin. Caleb fell to his knees, catching his son as the boy began to convulse, his skin already starting to radiate a terrifying heat that matched the serpent's glow. The anger that had fueled Caleb's rebellion vanished instantly, replaced by a raw, hollow desperation that brought him to the dust. He looked toward the heavens, his voice cracking as he let out a broken plea for a mercy he knew he did not deserve. He was helpless, holding the consequence of his own sin in his arms. The boy's fever was a physical presence, a radiant heat that seeped into Caleb's own skin as he huddled in the dim light of the tent. Outside, the world had changed. The atmosphere of arrogant defiance had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating mantle of grief. The rebellion was over because the people were broken. The silence was gone, replaced by the wailing of a nation that finally understood the cost of its ingratitude. Caleb looked at his son's pale face, glistening with sweat, and felt the sharp edges of his own guilt. Every bitter word he had whispered against the manna felt like a drop of the venom now coursing through the boy's veins. The camp was no longer a place of noise, but a landscape of mourning and shattered hearts. A movement outside drew his attention. People were gathering, dragging themselves toward the center of the camp where Moses stood. It was a pilgrimage of the dying. The people fell prostrate in the dust, their voices rising in a ragged chorus. "We have sinned," they cried, the words tasting like ash in their mouths. There was no more talk of returning to Egypt. They confessed their rebellion against the Almighty and their rejection of Moses. It was a raw admission of helplessness. They had looked into the eyes of judgment and found themselves wanting. Caleb wanted to join them, to add his voice to the plea, but he could not leave his son's side. He watched through the tent opening as the people begged Moses to intercede. Moses, the man they had threatened to stone, looked out over suffering with eyes that held no malice. He saw the fallen and the terror of the survivors and chose to stand in the gap. He turned and began to ascend the sun-scorched slopes of the nearby mountain. Caleb watched the prophet's figure until he was a speck against the stone. The wait that followed was an agonizing trial. In the camp, time seemed to warp. Each minute was measured by the labored breathing of the bitten. The sun hung low, a blood-red orb threatening to leave them in darkness. Caleb wiped his son's brow, but the water evaporated instantly against the boy's burning flesh. Would God have mercy on those who had called his provisions miserable? When Moses finally returned, the news was strange. He did not bring medicine or a ritual. Instead, he carried a divine instruction that defied logic. God commanded the creation of a bronze serpent, a replica of the creature that was killing them. It was to be hoisted high on a pole so everyone could see it. The promise was simple. Anyone who looked at the bronze image would live. To Caleb, it felt like a fever dream. How could looking at the likeness of death bring life? The serpent was the symbol of the curse and the source of the agony. It was a final test to see if they would trust God's word over their own senses. It was the ultimate paradox, where the source of death became the channel of grace for the fallen. The camp became a frantic workshop. Moses called for the craftsmen and whatever bronze could be spared. The fires were stoked until they roared with white-hot intensity, sending plumes of dark smoke into the twilight sky. Caleb watched as the metal melted into a glowing liquid river that mirrored the terrifying color of the serpent's scales. The rhythmic clanging of hammers began to echo through the valley, a metallic heartbeat signaling the end of the plague. Each strike was a testament to the intercession of the prophet and surprising grace of the Creator. Moses oversaw the work, his face illuminated by the forge's glow as the serpent took shape. It was a shimmering creature born of fire to conquer fire. As the sun's rays touched the horizon, the pole was brought forward. Caleb's son's pulse was now a faint fluttering thing, like the wings of a dying bird. The boy's skin was a ghostly, translucent white. Caleb gripped the boy's cold hand, his eyes searching the horizon for the lifted sign of salvation. The work was nearly finished, and the shadow of the pole began to stretch across the sand toward his tent. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and the metallic tang of molten bronze. Every heavy strike of the hammer against the anvil resonated through the valley, a rhythmic, driving beat that seemed to keep the flickering heart of the nation alive. Caleb heard artisans working in the center, their silhouettes dancing against the furnace's orange glow, which flickered like a warning. For every ringing blow that shaped the metal, another soul in the outskirts of the camp slipped into the final silence of death. The desperation was palpable, hanging over the tents like a heavy shroud. Moses stood at the heart of it all, his eyes reflecting the fire as he supervised the molding of the divine image. The serpent began to take shape, its body coiling around the wooden staff, its scales hand-chiseled with a precision that felt almost cruel. It was a mirror of the very agony that had decimated their ranks, a metallic reminder of the judgment they had brought upon themselves. When the work was finished, the pole was hoisted. It rose slowly, a vertical line of dark wood against the darkening sky, topped by the shimmering, fire-forged creature. It stood as a lonely, terrifying beacon, visible from the furthest reaches of the rocky, desolate plateau. The instruction from the mountain had been unnervingly simple. Anyone who looked upon it would live. No elaborate sacrifices or rituals were required. There was only the gaze. To Caleb, watching from his tent, the simplicity of the command felt like an insult. How could a piece of fashioned metal, a lifeless representation of the thing that had injected liquid fire into his child's veins, have any power over the rot devouring the boy's organs? It was a paradox that defied every natural law. The serpent was the curse. To look at it felt like looking into the face of death. His son's breathing had become a series of shallow, wet rasps. The boy's body was rigid, his skin a terrifying shade of ashen grey. Caleb's mind raced with doubts. He thought of Egyptian physicians and their herbal poultices. They required physical intervention, not a mere glance. He was a man of logic, a man who believed in the tangible. But as he looked at the cooling embers of his pride, he realized he had no other options left. The world was shrinking to this one, impossible choice. He could stay in the darkness and watch his bloodline end, or he could trust a word that sounded like madness. With a groan of effort, Caleb gathered the boy in his arms. The child was burning, a living ember against Caleb's chest. He stumbled out into the open air, where the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant wails of the many people mourning. His legs felt like lead as he moved toward a vantage point overlooking the camp and stopped. There it was, reflecting the last rays of the dying sun. The bronze serpent glowed with an eerie light, suspended between the heaven that had judged them and the earth that was consuming them. "Look, my son," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. "You must look." The boy's eyelids were heavy, glued shut by the fever. Caleb used his shaking fingers to gently pry them open, forcing the child's glazed eyes toward the gleaming standard. In that moment, Caleb's own gaze locked onto the bronze scales. He expected nothing, yet he hoped for everything. As the boy's eyes finally focused on the serpent, a sudden violent shiver ran through his small frame. Caleb gasped, fearing the end had come, but then he felt it, a miraculous, impossible cooling. The unnatural heat began to recede, flowing out of him like a tide. The boy's breath hitched, then smoothed into a deep, rhythmic sigh. The grey pallor of impending death lifted, replaced by a warm, healthy flush. The venom was being undone in an instant. The strike was cancelled by sight. Caleb fell to his knees, clutching his breathing child, weeping into the boy's hair. He looked up, and in the shifting light, the silhouette took a different form. The shadow cast upon the desert floor was no longer that of a snake. It was the haunting, undeniable shape of a cross against the sky. The shadow of the pole against the desert sand remained burned into Caleb's mind long after the miracle had passed. As years turned into centuries, the story of the bronze image became a testament to a God who could turn a symbol of destruction into a vessel of deliverance. Yet the meaning of the serpent remained shrouded in mystery, a divine riddle waiting for its true fulfillment. The people kept the story, but its purpose was not found in the dust of Zin. Instead, it surfaced in a quiet, moonlit room in Jerusalem, hundreds of years later. There, under the cover of night, a Pharisee named Nicodemus sat across from a young rabbi whose words felt like life itself. Nicodemus was a scholar of the law, yet he felt a spiritual thirst that no ancient scroll could quench. He sought answers about the kingdom, but he was about to receive a revelation that connected the ancient desert to the present in a way that defied human logic. Jesus looked at the teacher of Israel, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of oil lamps, and reached back into the archives of the desert. He did not speak of the law as Nicodemus expected. Instead, he spoke of the bronze serpent. He declared that just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. In that singular sentence, the strange event in Zin was transformed from a historical curiosity into a cosmic prophecy. The pole was the prototype for a much greater instrument of eternal salvation. The parallel was striking. The Israelites were dying of a literal poison they could not extract, a venom born of their own rebellion. Now Jesus was suggesting that all of humanity suffered from a spiritual venom that no human effort could cure. The ancient serpents were only shadows of the original serpent from Eden, whose bite introduced the poison of sin and death into the human heart. The mystery of the bronze serpent's form began to unravel. It had always seemed a paradox. Why would God command an image of the very creature that was killing the people? The answer lay in substitution. The bronze serpent had the appearance of the fiery snakes, but possessed none of their venom. It was a representation that bore the likeness of the judgment without the power to kill. In the same way, Jesus announced that he would take the form of sinful flesh. He would be lifted on a wooden pole, bearing the weight of the human curse, though he himself was without sin. The serpent on the pole represented sin being judged. By looking at it, the Israelites saw their own judgment already accomplished in the bronze. This was the gaze of faith, the recognition that the source of death had been conquered. The cross would become the ultimate pole, and the Son of Man would become the ultimate sacrifice, hanging there to absorb the judgment so that those who looked would live. This parallel extended to the very act of looking. In the desert, the bitten had a clear choice: focus on their own festering wounds, seek their own medicine, or turn their eyes to the center of the camp. To look at the bronze serpent was an act of total surrender, a raw admission that their own strength was gone. It was a simple gaze, yet it required the most profound kind of deep humility. This was the essence of the message Jesus gave to Nicodemus. The world was already bitten by ancient venom, and the only hope was looking toward the one lifted up. The bronze serpent was a shadow cast by the cross across the centuries, a promise that God would provide a way for the dying to live. As the conversation on the rooftop continued, the weight of this eternal truth settled over Nicodemus. The prophecy of the ultimate sacrifice was being unveiled. The pole was more than wood. It was the divine blueprint for a rescue mission that would culminate on Calvary. Every soul carries the mark of the serpent's bite, and the only cure is found in the one who was nailed to the tree, the only hope for a world paralyzed by the fear of death. The ancient dust of the desert of Zin eventually settled, but the echoes of that miraculous day remained etched into the collective memory of the survivors. Caleb, once a man of brittle faith and hardened logic, spent the remainder of his days narrating the story of the bronze image to every generation that followed. He would sit his son down, the boy whose skin was once a canvas of fever and death, and tell him that life is not merely about surviving the heat or finding the next water skin. He taught him that life is found in the specific direction of one's gaze. Caleb realized that the desert was never just a physical place, it was a condition of the human soul. Thousands of years have passed, yet the landscape remains remarkably unchanged. We find ourselves in a different kind of wilderness today, one not paved with sand and stones, but with the cold concrete of indifference and the shifting dunes of modern uncertainty. The serpents have changed their form, but their venom is just as potent as it was in the days of Moses. Today, the bite of the serpent manifests as the crushing weight of guilt, the suffocating grip of depression, and the paralyzing fear of a future that seems to offer nothing but dust. We are a people bitten by the ancient lie that we can save ourselves, that if we only try harder or build higher walls, we can keep the poison at bay. Yet, the infection of sin is internal, a corruption that runs through the veins of every human heart. We look at our own wounds, obsessing over the redness and the swelling, trying to bandage a spiritual hemorrhage with temporary distractions and fleeting pleasures. We search for medicine in achievements or relationships, yet the fever only grows. Like the Israelites huddled in their tents, we are surrounded by a darkness we cannot dispel by our own strength, but the invitation remains as simple and as scandalous as it was in the center of that camp. Look and live. It is a message of radical grace that offends the proud and rescues the broken. Grace is not a reward for those who avoided the bite. It is a lifeline for those currently dying from it. It does not demand that the victim crawl to the pole or prove their worthiness to be healed. It only asks for a turn of the head, an intentional shift of the eyes away from the trauma of the wound and toward the source of the cure. The bronze serpent was the shadow, but the cross is the reality. The one lifted up on Calvary took into his own body the full potency of the ancient venom. He became the likeness of our sin, absorbing the judgment we deserved, so that when we look at him, we do not see our condemnation, but our total liberation from the curse. Caleb's descendants carried this truth through the centuries, perhaps not fully understanding the architecture of the plan until the Son of Man stood upon the earth. They learned that God does not always remove the serpents from the camp immediately. Instead, he provides a way to survive the bite. The world we inhabit is still filled with the hissing of shadows and the sting of loss, but for those who have seen the one on the cross, the venom has lost its terminal power. The transition from death to life happens in a moment of profound surrender where we stop trying to heal ourselves and start trusting the healer. This is the definitive resolution to the human tragedy. The curse that began in a garden and reached a fever pitch in the desert was finally broken on a hill called Calvary. As you stand in your own wilderness today, feeling the heat of your struggles and the ache of your own failures, the question remains the same. The pole is still lifted high in the center of human history, visible to any soul willing to lift their head. Will you continue to stare at the venom coursing through your life? Will you remain fixated on the wounds that have defined your past and the scars that tell of your shame? Or will you look? There is a life that transcends the desert, a breath that overcomes the fever, and a hope that outlasts the grave itself. The gaze of faith is the only bridge between the dying and the divine. The choice is yours, laid out in the simplicity of a single act of trust. Do not look at the serpent's teeth that seek to consume you. Look instead at the Savior's sacrifice that seeks to restore you. In the vast expanse of your own desert, the invitation echoes across the ages, louder than any whisper of despair. Look at the one who took your place and find that the poison has no more claim over your soul. Look and live.